A common consensus is that the Not Cry Archon quest is a masterpiece, but it is also, in many ways, a technical and structural mess. And the most interesting thing about it is that both of those statements are true. When version 6.0 dropped, the community reaction was almost unanimous. It was hailed as the new gold standard, maybe the best introductory chapter the game has ever had. The praise was overwhelming, and for good reason. The narrative ambition, the character work, the way it finally pushes the main plot forward, it is a massive achievement. But that is the high-level view. That is the memory of the quest after the credits roll, after it ended. The moment-to-moment experience of actually playing through its 8-hour runtime tells a slightly different story. It is a story of brilliant ideas being let down by clumsy execution, of powerful emotional scenes being undercut by amateur-ish presentation. So today we're not here to argue if the quest was good or bad. The answer is, it's both. Instead, we're going to deconstruct this paradox. We will look at the disconnect between the story Genshin wanted to tell and the sometimes frustrating story we actually had to play through. Let's do a proper recap of the 6.0 Archon quest. The story begins with the Traveler and Innefa's journey to Not Cry. Upon arrival, the Traveler experiences a strong sense of deja vu, realizing that their spaceship first crash-landed here, even though their memories are hazy. Innefa explains Not Cry's unique 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗵 energy, and in Nasha Town, the Traveler and Innefa search for clues about the spaceship. They meet the owner of a tavern who mentions Grandmaster Varka of the Knights of Favonius has already passed through Not Cry and went off to buy some more milk. They also learn about Aino, a genius mechanic who created Innefa and a massive 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗵 energy cannon to fight the abyssal wild hunt. Aino and Innefa have a heartwarming if slightly dysfunctional reunion. Aino confirms she hasn't seen any parts of the Traveler's spaceship. The Traveler then encounters Flynns, a mysterious nonchalant-looking lightkeeper from the burial grounds. He possesses a unique lantern and talks about the wild hunt and the abyssal threats. He reveals he is stationed in the quiet of the graveyard, preferring it to urban life. And later they meet 𝗼𝗁, the mommy ASMR artist, the moon chanter of the Frost Moon Scions, who is distributing food. 𝗼𝗁 reveals her people worship the moon maiden Kotar and possess a sacred relic, the moon marrow, which can reveal the past. She privately confides in the Traveler that the moon her people worship is fake and struggles with how to reveal this truth. The plot thickens when the Traveler is confronted by a phantom of their sibling. This sibling plays on their trust, showing them how to bypass the Science's ancient trials to steal the moon marrow, promising it holds the key to their past. They succeed, but the phantom reveals the deception and vanishes with the relic, leaving the Traveler complicit. Immediately, news spreads that the moon marrow has been stolen. Simultaneously, Flynns' superior officer is found murdered, with evidence framing Flynns, who has gone missing. The story now follows two parallel investigations, recovering the stolen moon marrow and finding the fugitive Flynns before the Lightkeepers arrest him. The Traveler forms an alliance with 𝗼𝗁 and the cynical intelligence broker 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗁, head of the Curatorium of Secrets, who assigns her chaotic good employee 𝗬𝗐𝗍 to the case. The hunt for the relic leads to a major heist sequence as they infiltrate the heavily guarded 𝗬𝗐𝗍 facility. 𝗬𝗐𝗍 showcases surprising skills, managing to obtain a high-level access card and navigate the complex booby trap facility. Inside, they discover the real thief, 𝗼𝗁's childhood friend, who betrayed her people out of a feeling of abandonment and gave the moon marrow to the 𝗬𝗐𝗍. Sandrone, however, unexpectedly gives the moon marrow to the Traveler, stating she has no use for trophies. The investigation into the murder reveals that the officer they met earlier was an imposter. They eventually find the real Flynns, who explains he found strange crystalline fragments that emit abyssal energy, which he stored in his lantern. These fragments attract Rarer, and Flynns has been battling him in secret. The Lightkeepers' records on their officer's mechanical arm further reveals that the person they spoke with earlier was Rarer in disguise, who offlined the real officer and framed Flynns. Rarer's motivation is to absorb 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗵 energy to build his own fragmented body. The climax arrives as the Wild Hunt launches a massive attack. The Phantom sibling reappears, revealing his horrifying true form, Rarer of Sanari, one of the 5 infamous sinners of Khaenri'ah. He unveils his master plan. He impersonated the superior officer to get Not Cry's giant defensive cannon repaired and then aimed at his location, while simultaneously spreading rumors in the city to cause mass panic. His goal is to have the city fire its greatest weapon directly at him, allowing him to absorb its power and regain his strength. The final act is a frantic, multi different race against time. While 𝗼𝗵 and Nefer try to quell the riots Rere instigated in Nasha Town, the Traveler, Aino, and Nefa, and now vindicated Flins, battle their way into the cannon's control room to manually stop it. They only partially succeed. Rere absorbs enough energy to form a monstrous body, and the heroes only survive the ensuing battle thanks to the timely intervention of both Sandroni and the science's goddess, Columbina. The quest concludes with the new alliances forged between 𝗼𝗵's scions, Nefer's curatorium, Aino and Enefa's workshop, and the Lightkeepers to face Rere. The Traveler absorbs the Moon Marrow for safekeeping, and Flins is officially cleared of all charges, stepping up to take his fallen superior's place in the Lightkeepers, ready to lead the charge against the ongoing threat. With that proper context in mind, let's look at what made this story land so well. To really understand the impact of Not Cry, we have to look at where the game was right before it launched. The journey through the previous region, Natlan, well, the reception was mixed, which in online gaming discourse is a polite way of saying people were starting to get the pitchforks out. For a lot of players, the story just didn't quite land. Coming out of that, there was immense pressure on version 6.0. Players have come to expect a certain standard of quality. The bar was set incredibly high by the narrative complexity and the raw emotional power of Fontaine. Not Cry had to live up to one of the most acclaimed stories in the game's history. And then we got Not Cry. The initial response was immediate. Instead of being seen as just another solid update, the community consensus was that this was a new narrative benchmark for the game, a new higher standard that all future stories would be compared against. The sentiment online was loud. Across social media forums and video essays, you saw the same phrases over and over again. One of the best story quests in the game, if not the best, followed by the best version X.0 Archon quest we have ever had. And on the surface, it looked like an anonymous, triumphant return to form. But that is where the story gets a little bit more complicated, because that overwhelming praise doesn't quite paint the full picture. So let's start with what worked, because what worked really worked. The core reason this story felt so fresh and simple, they broke the formula. For 5 years, our journey has followed a predictable path. We arrive at a new nation, meet the Archon, solve its local crises, get our Archon sponsored travel visa, and then move on. Not Cry threw that entire structure out. It's an autonomous region with no Archon, no statues of the Seven, none of the usual gameplay or story anchors we have come to expect. This single change had a massive ripple effect. The central conflict was no longer about regional politics or another Gnosis collecting scheme. The stakes became primordial. They are tied to the oldest, most fundamental parts of this world's history. The story immediately pivots to cosmic mysteries, the true nature of the moon, the false sky, and most importantly, the Traveler's own origins. Not Cry feels less like another chapter and more like a narrative bridge, a deliberate detour designed to transition the entire game from its Nation of the Year story into its endgame story. And since there is no ruling god, this land becomes a neutral high-stakes battleground for everyone else. You have the Fatui, the long-absent Knights of Mondstadt led by Varka, and even the enigmatic witches Sabbat, all converging into this one place. It's basically the Avengers crossover episode of Genshin, if everyone in the Avengers apparently hated each other. The conflict is immediately global in scope. The biggest signal of this change is the new antagonist Rere. He is revealed to be one of the sinners of Kanria, a world-level threat tied to the deepest parts of the lore. It is a very different approach from Fontaine, which focused on a more abstract threat like the prophecy. Here, the danger is concrete, personal, and a sign that the writers are finally putting the main plots front and center. From a purely thematic standpoint, this was a masterful move that revitalized the story, raised the stakes, and promised answers to questions we have been asking for years. A grand cosmic story is nothing without the characters to ground it, and this is arguably where Not Cry shined the brightest. Let's start with the main character. The community's reaction to the Travelers in this quest was overwhelmingly positive. For the first time in 5 years, the Traveler was vocal, proactive. They finally felt present in their own story. The interesting thing, though, is how that improvement was delivered. For many players, myself included, the first half of the story felt familiar. The Traveler was still a bit of a passive observer, a cameraman watching events unfold. Our main contribution was nodding thoughtfully and occasionally asking Paimon to repeat what was just said, but louder. But somewhere around the middle, something clicked. The shift became noticeable. It was a slow burn, but at the end, the feeling was undeniable. The story was finally about them again. This was a critical success, especially when you consider the heated debate around the entire story, where many felt the Traveler was relegated into a passive side character. Not Cry seems to be a direct course correction to that specific criticism. This renewed focus was supported by an incredible assemblage ensemble cast. Take the two Fatui Harbingers, Columbina and Sandroni. Instead of one-dimensional villains, they were presented as complex individuals with a snarky, surprisingly amicable dynamic. They felt like colleagues, a much more sophisticated take on antagonists. And then you have a character like Jahoda. She generated almost zero excitement from trailers, but became a fan favorite in-game, a breakout MVP, thanks to vibrant animation and great comedic timing. The success of the cast comes from a shift towards building a character ecosystem. The story presents its cast in interconnected groups right from the start. This approach feels like a lesson learned from the critiques of the previous story quest. While they gave incredible depth to its core groups, it came to the cost of sidelining the rest of the cast. Not Cry, by contrast, manages to build its world through a wider, more integrated ensemble, which paid off beautifully. With rather smart character writing, it is fitting that the quest structure was just as innovative. The big change here was the seamless integration of character stories directly into the main plot. The personal quest for the new 5-star characters Llama and Flinns were woven into the Archon quest from the start to the finish. This single change fixed a problem the game has struggled with for years. Like, let's say, think back to Inazuma, where the main story would grind to a halt, forcing you to do other quests to continue. It was the video game equivalent of being in the middle of a spy thriller and suddenly having to stop everything to help two different people plan a fireworks festival. The whiplash was real. Or, look at Fontaine. Its middle acts were so disconnected that the community nicknamed the prison sequence the Fortress of Fillerpede, a long, boring piece of filler designed solely to pad out the story patch. Not Cry's approach is the solution. An 8-hour story quest rarely feels like a slog because it all floats so smoothly, with no jarring detours. Character development and plot progression are the same thing here. It is smarter than just combining quests though. The character conflicts became the very engine that drives the plot. For example, Llama's internal struggle with her religion is directly connected to the central mystery of the fake sky. More pointedly, Flinns' antisocial personality isn't just a quirk, it is the exact vulnerability that the villain exploits to frame him and set his entire plan in motion. The story doesn't happen to them, it happens because of them. From a game design perspective, this is an elegant solution. The business model needs you to be interested in the new banner characters, and the structure makes their stories essential. Playing the story makes you more invested in the characters, which in turn makes the story more impactful. It is a powerful loop that serves both the narrative and the business. So with a brilliant structure and revitalized plot, Not Cry should be a flawless experience. But this is where we have to talk about the disconnect between the idea of the quest and the experience of actually playing it. This is where the glaring crack starts to show. First, the dialogue and the pacing. Even with the improved structures, many sections were criticized for feeling like lazy walking sims. There was a sentiment that, while most of the dialogue was essential, the delivery was often a slog. Players have pointed out similar issues in other acclaimed quests. It is that feeling of being trapped in a conversation with no dynamic gameplay to break up the monotony. But the bigger issues, the ones that really broke immersion for a lot of people, were the technical presentation gaffes. The most obvious example was the transition.
You would be in like a scene, and the game would just, do a PowerPoint slide, like a presentation. I half expected to see a created by Microsoft Office 2003 watermark in the corner.
For a game of this scale, the multi-billion-dollar scale, it feels incredibly amateurish. On top of that, you have the lip syncing, which felt incredibly bad here. And perhaps the strangest omission was the music. For a game praised for its soundtrack, so many long, important scenes were just silent. It made the conversations feel empty, hollow, and I think it killed the emotional weight. But I don't know, maybe when I was playing it, it was bugged or something. And then there were the smaller nagging issues. The story sometimes expected you to know very obscure lore without explanation. The handling of the moon marrow, a super important artifact, was a letdown when Sandroni just gave it away. It has all the narrative weight of finding a legendary sword and the villain just goes, you can have it. It was taking up space. It was like that time where all of these Archons just give away their gnosis and be like, oh yeah, it's not important anyway. I'm gonna off-screen it. Like, it's the exact same feeling. I'm tired of this. And finally, Varka, teasing his arrival at the beginning and at the end of the quest without him ever showing up. It felt like a cheap bait and switch. And at this point, Varka is less of a character and more of a mythical cryptid, occasionally cited in off-screen events. Just let me see the blonde hot guy. It is not that hard. This huge-chested blonde guy. Just let me have a seat. But anyways, when you pull all of this together, where does that leave the Not Cry Archon quest? You have an overwhelming success story, a compelling setting, an evolved protagonist, excellent characters, and an innovative structure that set a new standard for the game. But that triumph was held back by significant, almost basic, flaws in the execution. The jarring transitions, the bad lip sync, the silent scenes, and the moments where the pacing grinds to a halt. And that is the core tension of this entire update. You have this brilliant, ambitious narrative vision being undermined by its own technical shortcomings. And then there's a fundamental disconnect between what the story achieved on paper and how it was delivered to the player. In a way, this paradox is something we also see with Fontaine. Both quests seems to follow a new design philosophy, the creation of a flawed masterpiece, you know? The writers have learned that a powerful character-driven emotional payoff can forgive a multitude of sins. Fontaine's finale was so spectacular that it made players forget how boring the middle section was. It proved that nailing the landing is what cements a story in the community's memory. Not Cry's success, despite its own flaws, kinda reinforces the idea. It is a new peak for the story, but it's an imperfect peak, built on the belief that a powerful ending is worth an uneven journey. But you know, that is all from me, 𝗖𝗍𝗆𝗆𝗵𝘁, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers-o!